Ukrainian victory. It's a phrase, I think, that a lot of people in the West, outside of Ukraine, have a hard time saying. It's an outcome, I think, that a lot of people in the West or around the world have a hard time imagining. After all, we think of Russia as a great power. We think of Ukraine as a smaller country. How could the Ukrainians win? And yet, we have to face a certain reality. The Russian army hasn't performed the way that many people in the West have expected. The chief mark that it's left on the territory of Ukraine is that of atrocity against civilians on the territories that it's occupied. Whereas the Ukrainians, on the other hand, have performed much better on the battlefield than many would have expected. And the reasons why they've performed better on the battlefield are very interesting. Because it's a country where people don't trust central power and don't want there to be even more centralized power coming from another country. Because as a decentralized society, decentralized in politics and in culture, Ukrainians are able to cooperate on a local level to carry out a war. But also because at perhaps the deepest level, Ukrainians are aware, and we're aware more quickly than we, although we're catching up, that this war is existential. It's about whether or not their state, their nation, their society, whether they themselves as a people continue to survive. But Ukrainian victory, what would that mean? Why is that so important? It's obviously important, first of all, for the country itself. A war that continues like this leads to the destruction of the Ukrainian cities. It leads to the destruction of Ukrainian agriculture. It leads day after day to more and more senseless death. And behind the lines where Russia occupies, it leads to more and more deportations, abductions, and executions. Less obvious, though, is how important Ukrainian victory would be for Russia. For Russia to become a country where leaders have to listen to people, Russia has to cease being an empire or an aspiring empire. The ability to intervene abroad, the ability to fixate the attention of leaders and media and public abroad is also the ability to distract from basic questions of public affairs, like the rule of law, like corruption. For Russia to become a better Russia, Ukrainian victory is necessary. And this is true also for Russian culture. It's incontestable that Russian culture is a global culture. It's incontestable that Russian culture has influenced not just its own region, but thought and literature and politics around the world. But Russian culture is suffering now because Russians are fighting a war in the name of a big lie. Russian culture is suffering now because Russia is discrediting itself around the world. So in order for Russia to become a normal country, but also for Russian culture to become what it ought to be, Ukrainian victory is necessary. Third, though, if the world is going to avoid a famine, Ukrainian victory is necessary. The only way for this war to end quickly is for the Ukrainians to win. And if we're going to avoid famine, then Ukrainian food supplies must be sent through the Black Sea this autumn and in all the months and years to come. The only way to get there is for Ukraine to win as a sovereign country. And perhaps even more broadly, and fourth, this war is about the long-term future of humanity. It's about whether or not we continue to have wars which are in the interests of the same people who control energy supplies. The 21st century, if we don't do something about it, is going to be a series of wars like this, where those oligarchs who control the hydrocarbons are going to be setting the tone for everyone else. The war in Ukraine in 2022 is a very powerful reminder that we have to move away, not just from Russian hydrocarbons, but from hydrocarbons in general, if you want to have peace in this century, or if you want to have survival in this century. And finally, last but not least, as people say, there's also the question of values. If the Ukrainians had given up at the beginning, if President Zelensky had fled, where would we be now in our discussions of democratic values? The fact that President Zelensky remained in Kiev, the fact that Ukrainians defended their own democracy, took risks for their own democracy, has given people around the world who would like to think that values are real, who would like to think that rights are possible, who would like to think that we can govern ourselves as democracies. It's given such people not just hope, but also energy and I think a more excited and at the same time realistic vision of what a future might look like, a future of cooperation, of pluralism, of the rule of law. So for those values, Ukrainian victory, I think, is also very much needed.